Hey everybody, it's Kat, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Backstory Sessions. I'm joined today by my co-host Willie. Hey Willie,
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well, and this episode today, Willie, the topic is very important that this film addresses, and I'm looking really forward to how our guest dealt with the emotional side of this.
Okay.
Uh,
Yes.
I mean, don't you think that it would be, some things are like emotional, but dementia and, you know,
Yes.
a
It's
lot of
very
a lot of people have been through that with their parents or, someone they love. And
right.
so I just really look forward to hearing this story.
Oh, I do too.
All right, well, let's go ahead and introduce our guest today.
Okay.
Because she's an award-winning filmmaker and director, Sarah Friedland, and this is the debut feature film, Familiar Touch, and it's won several awards. And today we're going to talk about the journey that led her to filmmaking and also the inspiration behind Familiar Touch and how a story about dementia becomes really a story about humanity, I think. So, Sarah, I want to welcome you to Backstory Sessions. We're really excited to have you today and hear your story.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you for that beautiful intro.
Oh, you're welcome. So, before Familiar Touch, what's your story? Like, what drew you to storytelling?
Hmm. It's been a winding path. I've always loved image making and movement. As a kid, I was really into dance and photography, and I think those two forms of storytelling were kind of on a collision course for me and led to my starting to make experimental dance films as a college student. And my early work, I was making films that weren't so much about dance, but using choreography to look at movement patterns of the world around us, of everyday movement and the kind of politics and kind of social meanings inscribed in those movements of everything from how a crowd works to disaster preparation drills. So prior to making Familiar Touch, that was my focus. Um, and for many years, I worked for other filmmakers as my day job. I did, every kind of entry level job in the industry you can do. I was every kind of PA and assistant there is practically. Um, and after a while, I reached a point where I felt like I was getting this amazing education in film production through those jobs, but I wasn't really learning that much more about humanity. And it felt like, if I want to ultimately make films that are humanist tales, I need to find other ways to learn about people while being paid because I live in New York City. And in case you haven't heard, it's incredibly expensive here.
Yes, I might have heard mention of that. So,
Um,
did you
oh,
ever want to do anything else, like in high school, or, did you see another path?
well, so I ended up taking another path kind of midway through those production jobs. I started working as a caregiver for older adults with dementia in New York as one of my part-time day jobs because as a way to learn about people kind of outside film production. And that led to me training to become a teaching artist and teaching filmmaking to older adults in different community settings. And this was a path that I never imagined as a kid or a teenager. I, really always saw myself in just a different in different creative careers. But caregiving, learning how to be a caregiver, I think has been more impactful on my creative life and how I direct than any of the film jobs that I had. Um, so for about let's see, for 7 years, I did different work in intergenerational spaces and spaces where I was caregiving.
So what was caregiving like in terms of, I know you said that you kind of saw the world through patterns of movement and what that all would mean. So what did you notice in the caregiving community?
So the first job I had was doing part-time care, home care for older adults in Manhattan with dementia. And for the most part, I was doing care that was to relieve primary caregivers who were loved ones. So, let's say a spouse was the primary caregiver for their partner. I would come in twice a week so that primary caregiver could have time for themselves. Because, as you might know, there are very high rates of depression and overwhelm and loneliness among family caregivers. So it was a specific type of caregiving, and so much of what I noticed was that the narrative that people around the person with dementia had was so different than the narrative the person had about themselves. That the older adults I cared for still saw themselves as the protagonist in their own story, and their dementia, their memory loss was a part of their experience, but was not the defining feature of how they saw themselves. And that, I think, is the really big gap that we as a society tend to see someone with memory loss or just see someone who needs care, who is aging, and see that as a deficit and as a loss, and that is the first thing we think about when we think about that person, as opposed to all of the other qualities that continue, that make them who they are. And so, I saw this a lot with my clients' loved ones, that there was this sort of air of tragedy with how they spoke about their loved one, which is so understandable. Of course, they're going through a major loss and a huge transition. It's not that that's not there, but sometimes it eclipsed the person who remained. So that was a big thing I noticed.
So, did any of the people with dementia or that were just aging, like, did they talk about the impact of that perception from their loved ones and what that actually meant to them or how it made them feel?
Not so explicitly, because all of the people I cared for were in a stage of their dementia where that level of kind of lucid analysis would be hard for them to express with clarity. But it came through in other ways. I remember one client of mine, her adult child was speaking to me about her mother's care. And she said to me, you're talking about me and I'm right here. I'm right here. And so that kind of the response to being marginalized in the way that older adults are came out in other ways. And I saw my clients um, searching for ways to express their autonomy and agency and dignity. And of course, their adult children were incredibly well meaning. And of course, those conversations still needed to happen. But I was really kind of moved and blown away by the ways in which um, I saw older adults claim themselves, even as the world around them focused on them saw them as a sort of character in a tragedy, which is, I think, part of where I wanted to intervene with Familiar Touch, is that most of our films about experiences of aging are structured as tragedies, even though aging and ultimately death are things that all of us experience. And so I wanted to find kind of form for the film that didn't didn't frame our protagonist's experience as a tragedy of loss, but rather as a coming of age, as a transition, um, that we should all be so lucky to experience.
Why do you think we see aging and death in in that way. I mean, there's many like periods and chapters of life that you look forward to and you see as a positive. So, why did it get this negative connotation?
Ooh, how much time do you have? There's so much I can say. I'll try to be concise here. And I would really recommend there's a brilliant British scholar named Lynn Siegel who writes about this, and her work has been really impactful for my thinking. Um, I think a big part of it is capitalism, that, under capitalism, people are valued for their productivity. And as soon as someone is no longer kind of seen as productive and capacious within our marketplace, we devalue them. And then, of course, we devalue the people caring for those people. I think that's a real part of why care labor is so deeply undervalued, both socially but also financially. It's one of the most low paid jobs, at least in America. I can't speak to other places, even though I think it's the most important work there is. It's literally life sustaining work. But I think because we see older adults as no longer productive and capacious, we undervalue them. And I think the things that we undervalue, we diminish. I think there's a relationship between that kind of like marketplace view of older adults with the kind of language of cuteness that makes older adults small and kind of infantilizes them. I at one point tried to ban the word cute from my set because I find it so diminishing of our elders. So I think that relationship to productivity is a part of it, and I think also our fear of death, that people don't want to contend with the fact that they themselves will get older and one day die, and therefore there's an aversion to being in spaces where aging and proximity to death are really apparent and kind of just sort of manifest in daily life. And it was one of the most inspiring parts of our film set. We shot in a real care facility in Los Angeles called Villa Gardens, and I noticed that a lot of our crew were nervous going in. They thought it was going to be really depressing being in this space where people were aging and being cared for, and watching our mainly millennial crew come to have the time of their lives. That it was such a joyful set. It couldn't be further from um, um, their expectation, which is it was a place where people were waiting to die rather than a place where people were continuing to live. I think that um, just to go back to the earlier point about capitalism, I think that we live in a world where our sense of self worth also has a lot to do is deeply connected to an idea that we are autonomous and self-reliant and self-sufficient, and we value that over an ethics of interdependence. And this is something Lynn writes about beautifully, that all of us, the reality is that all of us are interdependent and give and receive care from birth until death. That is not something, care is not something specific to aging. We come into the world needing care. And there is care and interdependence in so many of our relationships that we don't acknowledge as such. And so I think it's also that emphasis on being self-reliant that leads us as a society to devalue older adults who need interdependence and need care.
It's a very interesting. And did you find any cultures that perhaps do value aging and look at it differently than the US um, as a whole seems to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I'm the daughter of a sociologist, but I'm not one myself. So I'm not an expert here, but I will say one of the great joys of the last 2 years sharing the film is I've gotten to screen it all over the world in practically every continent, and in each Q&A getting to hear from people in other cultures about how they both their care systems and also their care values. And there are many cultures around the world where older adults are esteemed as elders, and their experiences are really cherished and sought out. I'm sad to say that I don't live in one of those cultures. I wish I did. And I think, of course, also like just the relationship of globalization and capitalism means that an American view of older adults is creeping in elsewhere. But it was really, I can't. I wish I had a better specific example, and it's been more of this kind of like quick stop tour. So I've only gotten little tastes of other cultures in their relationship to aging, but certainly there are other ways to value elders.
Well, and I'm sure that must be refreshing, as you do the Q&As and get to learn, some other ideas and how people are viewed. So that's really cool to have that experience across the world, basically. You said that you know, that this has been in most of the continents. So, how exciting. I mean, I can only imagine creating something and then getting that different perspective feedback. So, Willie, this before we get into the film itself, do you have a question?
Uh, Prior to working with, these people, did you have a personal experience yourself with someone who had dementia?
Yeah, I did. My paternal grandmother had dementia and lived in the memory care wing of an assisted living facility in the last few years of her life. And my relationship to her and um, her experience of memory loss and transitioning into being cared for full time was very much the starting point for wanting to make this film. And part of it was because my grandmother couldn't be further away from our cliches and tropes about little old ladies. She was an intellectual and an editor and absolutely fierce. Not a single person could call her cute or sweet. She was force to be reckoned with.
Oh,
And when she when she started becoming viewed by other people as old, and when she started needing care, I saw that friction between this woman who had lived through in her lifetime a period where women were, I mean, still are undervalued and diminished in our society, and seeing her kind of live through these different ways of feminist revolution and claiming a sort of fiercely independent life and identity for herself, and then seeing the transition to um, being cared for, where she was, I could see her kind of bristling up against um, an experience of being viewed as not powerful and as a diminished version of herself, and that witnessing that and trying to imagine what it might be like for her was part of the jumping off point for this story.
okay.
So, as you were planning to direct this film, um, what led to you knowing that this is a project that I'm going to take on?
Um, there's a mystery around the projects that we pick or that pick us, I find that it's when I'm absolutely obsessed with something and can't stop thinking about it, that it's almost like I've already decided I'm going to make it. And so I can't remember. There wasn't really a time in between coming up with the idea and deciding that this is what I was going to make. It was like the idea emerging immediately became, I have to make this film. Um, so I know it's different for every artist, but for me, if I feel a sense of kind of absolute obsession within me, then I know that's the film I'm going to make.
So, as you said, maybe it's chosen you. Because sometimes I think creative things do seem like they choose the medium that's going to bring them to the world. Okay, so you become obsessed and you know this is what you're going to do. What are the obstacles? Like what all is involved from the concept to bringing it to fruition?
Oh, I mean, so many. It took close to a decade to make this film. And part of that time was me learning how to make a feature film for the first time. But a big part of it was trying to find the resources to do it. Um, we've been talking about ageism. Perhaps unsurprisingly, most film financiers didn't think that a character study of an older woman with memory loss and her relationship to herself would be a good commercial bet for investment. And we kept hearing from funders, this isn't sexy. And I, kept saying, well, actually it is. Sort of that's the point, that we don't see older women as sexy, and her relationship to her sexuality is actually a big part of the story. And it's sexy, quote unquote, in another way, in that, like, the we are going through this huge demographic shift, not only in the US but across the world, of there being more older adults, relative to younger generations, and we don't have the care systems in place to care for them. And this is a massive, massive issue that we don't want to talk about. And so a big a big part of the kind of timeline, and the long timeline of making this, was just um, trying to find the financing. Um, I also spent a long time trying to find the right care facility to collaborate with, because it's not only a film that we set within a care facility, but we made it through a process collaborating with their residents and staff. And so it took a long time to find Villa Gardens, the community in Pasadena where we filmed, because we were looking for somewhere where there was a culture of lifelong learning, where the community would embrace the idea of making a feature film almost as an intergenerational artist residency. And this community is really unique, and welcomed this collaboration. Um, so, I think resources was probably the hardest part. There are 1,001 things that go wrong in the process of making a film, but certainly finding resources is, I think, the 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 biggest mountain to climb.
So, tell us about Ruth and how did you decide this is the story I want to tell?
Ruth, Ruth weaves together so many incredible women that I've known. Um, the first draft had the kind of loudest echoes of my grandmother in it. And then as I went along over the many years of revising, she took on threads of people I'd cared for, and people I have worked for, and people I've met briefly. She ended up kind of absorbing all of these textures of amazing older women that I've had the privilege to either care for or know. And I was thinking also, I alluded to this a little bit in talking about my grandmother, but I was thinking about this generation of women for whom independence and choice were not something they took for granted and were things that were hard won. And imagining Ruth coming of age in this moment of counterculture, both around feminism, but also in terms of anti-war protests and civil rights, and this moment of real kind of um, cultural and political shift in the U.S. and what thinking about women who came of age at that time and where they are now and who's caring for them and what that feels like. Um, so in some ways, it was an homage for me to this generation of women that I feel paved the way for my generation of female artists and feminists. Um, and then in terms of her becoming a cook, she's a cookbook author and a cook. I knew early on that she would be a creative of some kind. And I came to cooking because for two reasons. One is it appeals to all of the senses, and the language of the film I knew would be very kind of sensory. And so food is something that is, it's visual and olfactory and gustatory. And so I was excited about food as an art form that appeals to all senses. And then also was interested in it just in terms of its feminist politics of, the food industry being really male dominated, but at the same time, as cooking is seen as women's work. So that friction was something that interested me in building her character.
And how did you choose the actress that was going to play her? Like, did you know instantly this is going to
Yeah,
be the match?
it took a long time to find each other, and it took so long to make the film that when we first started casting, Kathleen was actually too young to play the role. Um, but once I met Kathleen, I mean, I'd been a big fan of hers for years, but as soon as we met, it was kind of one of those love at first sight moments where it was like, oh yeah, it has to be her. And we had a kind of it had almost kind of unspoken trust from day one. It really was a magical experience of like she stepped onto set and we looked at each other and we knew we understood each other. Um, so there's a strange and magical alchemy to these things sometimes. And this was a part that only I now know only she could have played, and it had to be her. I didn't know that when I first started writing, but I know that now.
So, was there anything that surprised you that you just didn't expect after while you were filming? Did you just have some kind of, I don't know, thought or some premonition that you just never had or didn't expect to have?
Hmm, interesting question. Um, I mean, I feel like the experience of filmmaking is always kind of part part preparation and part accident, and there's sort of these beautiful serendipitous accidents that happen. Um, I think in the case of our film, the greatest surprise was how, and it wasn't really a surprise to me. It was maybe an open question that was answered beautifully. Was to what extent would the older adults in that were living at Villa Gardens want to take ownership of the film? And the answer was immensely. They were involved in every element of production, and they got involved with casting, with the art department, with camera, and I had a hunch that that would happen. That if we created the right collaborative environment, that there would be that intergenerational um, dynamic. But seeing it happen, sort of nothing could have surprised, nothing could have really um, prepared me for how extraordinary it felt for that collaboration to come alive.
It's amazing. All right, Willie, I know our time is running short, but did you have a final question you wanted to ask?
Yes. What would you hope that the message? What message are you hoping to get across to
Hmm.
viewers and you know of the film?
It's a question that I'm always hesitant to answer because I feel like um, if I've done my job well, the film will speak for itself. But I guess if I had to say, I hope that people will come away feeling connected to the continuity of who we are, that aging is not just a series of losses, but there is a continuity of a person being themselves, and to come away with I think greater respect for the people who care for older adults, and the labor that they do that is so crucial and so skilled, and deeply undervalued.
Was there any difference that people pointed out in people caring for those with dementia and then those caring for someone who maybe had a stroke or, has aged and is maybe having something like the physical limitations versus, dementia or something like that? I mean, is everybody kind of diminished in the way they're viewed, no matter?
I my the data I have is really kind of anecdotal of hearing from older adults and caregivers while sharing the film. So I don't know that I can um, answer that question in a really comprehensive way, but I think what is universal is that anyone needing care wants their dignity and their self to be honored as they're cared for. And we need to have greater support both for the person being cared for and the caregiver to ensure that that relationship can have um, dignity and mutual support. And I think that is true for any experience of needing care.
So my final question, I guess, is from the perspective of, the person being cared for. What do you think their message might be to us?
To see me as the person that I continue to be rather than the person that I no longer am.
That is very beautiful, and I think we would all be wise to listen really hard to that. So, if people want to see the film and follow its journey, where's the best way to do that?
Well, it's coming out in the UK on June 19th, so you can see it at a theater near you. And all of the theaters are listed on the Bulldogs film website, our distributor in the UK. If you're in the US, it's streaming on Mubi, and you can rent it anywhere that you rent a movie at home. So iTunes, YouTube, Apple, etc. And then everywhere it's, in a lot of other countries, I'm not exactly sure how to access it in each place, but if you Google Familiar Touch wherever you live, you can um, find the nearest way to see it.
All right, and what's next for you? Have you already started a new project or?
I am. It's early days, so I'm keeping it close to home. But I'm working on my next feature right now.
Great. Well, we hope that you will come back and share that with us. This has been very fascinating and
Yes, it has. Really enjoyed you.
sounds like a
Thank you so much for the great conversation. It's been a joy.
yes. All right. So, everyone follow Sarah and, you know, give some thought to the words that she's spoken today about how we view people and how others might be viewing us one day. Thank you again, and best wishes.
Thanks so much. Hope you have a